Saints, and I hope that you are all well and are enjoying life as we head deeper into the month of May. The month of April was a pretty cool month for lots of reasons because we celebrated Easter, because of all the other kinds of fun stuff, and it was also a cool month of Bible reading. And so I wanted to give a quick summary of the Bible reading that we did in our journey through the Bible in this year and the books that we covered in particular during the month of April. So here's our April summary. As you might remember, all the way back to April Fool's Day, we started on 2 Samuel chapter 18, and there we arrived at a particularly stressful time during the kingship of King David. Right at the beginning of that time, we saw that David's son Absalom had revolted against him and had became king or crowned himself king with the support of many of the people. And so there was a back and forth. And so at the beginning of this past month's reading, we saw the finale of that his son was defeated and ultimately lost his life, much to the sadness and chagrin, understandably, of David. Just in case that wasn't enough, Sheba, a member of the tribe of Benjamin, also revolted against David, and many of the other tribes joined him as well. And so we see here, we think of King David as being this great king, and he was. And it's pretty clear from this part in 2 Samuel that his hold on the people and on the kingdom was tenuous at best. And we'll see this play out in particular in future generations. Right after that, in chapter 21, we have this really interesting and harrowing and shocking story about the Gibeonites and their need to expiate the blood guilt. And so we see King David kill some of the remaining descendants of Saul, and all this is out there. All this to say is that the end of 2 Samuel and the end of David's kingships kind of makes sense why he didn't live that long. It's funny because he became king at 30 years old and he died at 70. Now that might seem kind of young, but I guess if you dealt with all that in the midst of your life and had all that stress, you probably wouldn't make it that long either. So anyways, that is King David. And then we get to the book of First Kings. There's a struggle for succession. And so while we all think of Solomon as the one who was to be king, he actually wasn't the first of David's sons. And therefore, one of the other sons of David proclaimed himself king, and then there was a struggle there. In the end, Solomon had to end the life of his own sibling. And then we finally have King Solomon taking over for David. At this point, we have the famous story in chapter 3 of King Solomon when God asked him to ask for anything. He asked for wisdom. He prays for wisdom. And from then on, things go really, really well for a while. King Solomon builds the temple. There's a whole situation with that. There's great prosperity. In many ways, this is looked upon as the golden age. Then we get to chapter 10 in First Kings, and we have the visit of the Queen of Sheba. Now, this is particularly interesting. It shows how she comes, and she is so taken aback by his wisdom and all he has that it says that, there was no spirit left in her, that she had her breath taken away by how awesome he was. And that's more or less what it says. That she came, she spent a while for him, he made a house for her, and then she goes back home. What it doesn't say is very much about their relationship. But for all my Caribbean folks out there, or folks who are lovers of history, you might know that according to legend, when she returned back to her kingdom in Ethiopia, when she returned there, she returned not only with some riches and some gifts from Solomon, but she also returned bearing his child, and that child became known as sort of the Lion of Judah in some ways, and was the ancestor of Haile Selassie, who was sort of the patriarch of the Rastafarian movement. And so we see from chapter 10 in First Kings, perhaps the relationship that got all of that started. So things are going really well, but then they started not going well. Starting in chapter 11, we see that Solomon made some errors. Part of his connections to all these other foreign people and foreign women, as they say in the scriptures, meant that he started worshiping other gods. And so God said, I will take away the kingdom, but not from you for the sake of David, but rather from your son. So that happens. And his son Rehoboam eventually has a kingdom taken from him, and he eventually ends up with just a tribe of Judah and some Levites in the tribe of Benjamin, and the rest of the tribes go under Jeroboam. So we have Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and from here on out, the kingdoms were divided. And so you had the southern kingdom, which is Judah, Jerusalem, and then you had the northern kingdom, whose center was Samaria. And so that's what we had there. And we continue on. And so after this, there are many different stories of these different kings. The common theme here is that the kings of Judah sometimes are good, sometimes are bad. The kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, are always bad. Makes you wonder who wrote this. But anyway, foremost of these sort of evil rulers was King Ahab and his evil queen Jezebel. And right around their time, we see a new prophet show up, and that is Elijah. Now, Elijah shows up and lets Ahab and Jezebel know that this is not okay, and so they seek his life. There's an amazing showdown between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, sort of a rival god for the people's affections, in chapter 18. That's amazing. Definitely check that out in 1 Kings. And then towards the end of 1 Kings, we meet Elisha, who is to become Elijah's protege, and so the mantle is passed on to Elisha. 2 Kings begins, and we have more stories of kings, some good, most of them bad, and we hear Elisha's exploits, other amazing things that happen. Come fast forward to chapter 17, the northern kingdom known as Israel is taken off into exile into Assyria. In the previous chapters, we've seen that other groups from Egypt, from Assyria, and from Babylon start coming in and snipping at different parts of Israel and Judah. And eventually, in chapter 17, the northern kingdom is taken away to Assyria. In chapter 22, we have another succession of kings of Judah, now trending more bad than good. But then we have King Josiah, who is sort of the last really good king of the people of Judah. And he gets the people back, at least in sync for a while, through reading the book of the law. So if you look at chapter 22, you'll read a little bit about King Josiah. The interesting thing is that the names Joshua, like Joshua, son of Nun, King Josiah, and Jesus, that those names are all essentially the same name and all closely related, and they were all leaders who helped the people stay really true to God. And so this time of being true to God didn't last very long. And by chapter 25, the southern kingdom of Judah is taken off to Babylon and exile as well. And then the last reading for April was the beginning of the book of Chronicles, where we read a bunch of names. And so that's it. That's a summary of everything that was covered in May. I hope that you enjoyed the reading. I hope this summary was a helpful summary for you, or if you didn't get a chance to read it, at least helps fill in some of the gaps. And I look forward to seeing you all soon. Have a great one.